The hospital was nearly empty that gray morning, as if even the weather sensed that something strange was about to happen. Jason entered in a rush, eyes unfocused, palms sweaty. He had been called for an urgent donation. His rare blood type could save someone in critical condition. He had no idea who the patient was. As he approached the reception, time seemed to shatter. Sitting there, flipping through an old pamphlet, was his mother. Same posture, same serene gaze, same blue knit sweater she wore the last day he saw her. But that was impossible. His mother had died 15 years earlier in a fire. He had identified the body himself. Heart collapsing, Jason stepped closer, calling her name. But the woman only smiled, puzzled, and said he must be mistaken. The sound around him faded. Before him was not a ghost, nor a hallucination. She was real, alive. But she didn't remember him, as if she were someone identical from another life. Jason grew up in Fairhill, a modest town in rural Oregon where time seemed to move more slowly. At 17, his life changed forever when a fire destroyed his home and took the life of his mother, Margaret. The memory of smoke, distant sirens, and the sight of a body covered in a white sheet would follow him like a constant shadow. He was then raised by his paternal grandmother, a practical and affectionate woman marked by resignation. Jason tried to move on, but something never fully healed. His grief was not just for the loss, but for the feeling that something about that night was out of place, like a blurry photo he kept trying to recall clearly but never could. As an adult, at 32, he worked as a lab technician at a hospital in the same region. He was reserved, dedicated, known among colleagues for his willingness to help, especially in the rare cases of AB-negative blood donations. He had no children, few friends. Life moved on, unmoving, like dry leaves stuck on a branch waiting for a wind that never came. On a cold autumn morning, he received a call from the infirmary. A young woman was in critical condition, and among the few compatible donors in the town, he was the only hope. Jason hung up without hesitation and headed straight to the hospital with an uneasy sense that the day would not be ordinary. That was when he walked through the glass doors and saw her. Sitting in the lobby, hair tied simply, pamphlet in hand, was his mother. Same elegant posture, same contained gaze. She wasn't similar, she was her, the woman he had buried 15 years ago. Time stopped, and the world suddenly went silent. Jason stood frozen before that impossible vision. The woman looked at him lightly, not recognizing his face, and returned a polite smile. He approached slowly, called her by name, Margaret, but she frowned, confused. She said her name was Emily Foster and that she didn't know who he was. That broke something inside him. Still stunned, Jason proceeded with the donation. In the quiet hallway, the hum of the centrifuge seemed to echo inside his mind, mixed with childhood memories. Could he be losing his mind, or was someone playing with his pain? But the most disturbing thing was that deep down, he knew that woman was his mother. In the following days, Jason began to frequent the hospital with subtle excuses. He observed Emily Foster from a distance. She seemed kind, serene, and kept a quiet routine between appointments and visits to her hospitalized daughter. Everything about her reminded him of his mother. Her hand gestures, the way she tilted her head when listening. It was like recognizing an old song through static. Determined to find out who she was, he accessed medical records, searched public files, and found that Emily had been admitted to the hospital weeks earlier after a nervous breakdown. The young woman she cared for was her daughter, Grace, hospitalized with a rare infection. The official story said Emily lived in another city, was widowed, and had never been to Oregon. Jason returned to his grandmother's house and sifted through the past. Among old papers, he found a document long ignored, a police report from 15 years ago where his mother testified as a witness against a drug cartel operating in the area. Days later, the fire happened. A suspicion began to take shape. What if the fire had been staged? What if Margaret had been placed in witness protection? The memories of the closed casket, the few authorities at the funeral, now seemed suspicious. He had lived 15 years of grief over an absence built in silence. Back at the hospital, he crossed paths with Grace again, the hospitalized young woman. A nurse mentioned she needed a donor with an extremely rare blood type and that Jason was a miracle. The detail froze him. Grace had the same blood type as him, and that, biologically, made it nearly impossible for her not to be his half-sister. The blood coincidence was the spark. Jason could no longer ignore what his instincts screamed. He returned to the hospital filled with anger and hope, ready to confront Emily or Margaret with the truths he had carried for years. He brought with him a photo of his mother holding him as a baby and a copy of the police report. He found her sitting in the waiting room outside Grace's room. He approached cautiously, knelt before her, and placed the photo in her lap. Emily remained silent. Her eyes filled with tears before any words were spoken. Jason then talked about the fire, the absence of a body in the casket, the lingering sense of a lie. She didn't deny it. Her trembling hand held the photo like someone touching a lost memory. With a choked voice, she said her real name was Margaret, that everything had been arranged after she reported a criminal group, and that the authorities convinced her to fake her death to protect her son. She had no choice, and the pain of separation had followed her ever since. She explained she had lived in a remote town under a new identity, constantly watched. Grace was born years later, the result of a discreet relationship that also ended for security reasons. Jason was her firstborn, her first life, and not a day passed that she didn't think of him. She revealed that, in secret, she followed the news, searched for photos, and prayed he was well. Jason listened in silence. There was no villain in that story, only accumulated losses. He felt the ground open beneath him. He cried for everything at once, the absence, the lie, and the interrupted life that now began to rebuild. Margaret asked for forgiveness, eyes brimming and her body curved as if carrying decades of guilt. Jason didn't respond immediately. He just held her hand. It was fragile, as if time had left marks that makeup couldn't hide. But she was his mother, and that was enough. In that moment, something changed. The pain didn't disappear, but it ceased to be poison. It became a bridge. And although they didn't know what would come next, they knew something had been restored. Not the past, but the possibility of the present. In the following days, Jason began visiting the hospital frequently. With every brief conversation with Grace, every silent glance exchanged with Margaret, something within him began to realign. There were no future plans, no certainties, just the slow reconstruction of bonds broken by fear and survival. Grace was recovering well. She had the same sparkle in her eyes that Margaret had in old photos. Jason watched her with discreet tenderness, avoiding rushing revelations that would require time. He knew he now carried not just his own story, but also the duty to protect this new life emerging beside him. Margaret, in turn, seemed lighter. There was still guilt, but also redemption. For the first time in many years, she could call her son by his real name, and see that he had not become a stranger, but a reflection of everything she had hoped to protect. The silences between them grew shorter, and their gazes longer. Jason chose to keep everything secret. He would not expose the scheme, nor demand public explanations. He understood that certain acts of love require silence. Forgiveness did not come as a speech, but as presence. He had forgiven not only his mother, but himself, for so many years of anger kept against an absence that now had a name and a face. Before leaving the hospital for the last time that week, he left an envelope on Margaret's desk. Inside, a photo of the two of them, cut from an old album, and a single handwritten sentence: "I never stopped looking for you." As he crossed the glass doors, he took a deep breath. For the first time in years, he felt he could move on without carrying ghosts. Stories like Jason's remind us that the unexpected can turn grief into reunion and silence into redemption. If this journey touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving your support with a click. And if you want to keep exploring stories as emotional as this one, the next video is already waiting for you, with other hidden truths and encounters that leave a mark forever.